Hi, my name is Martin Ng and I am a baritone, and welcome back to another episode on the Martin Ng channel. I apologize for my long absence from uploading new educational videos on opera. Well, I have been uploading videos of my performances and videos of my singing, but not educational videos. And here, I hope that I have not kept my followers waiting too long, because today I'm going to present to you a new episode. Now remember, in many previous episodes ago, with my friend, musicologist Daniele Garuti, we introduced 5 difficult arias for the tenor voice. And then subsequently, in another previous episode, I talked about 5 difficult arias for baritone. So guess what? In today's episode, I'm going to talk about 5 difficult arias for bass. So as we all know, we associate the tenor voice with the romantic hero and the baritone voice usually as maybe a father figure or a jealous love rival. How about the bass voice? The bass voice is the lowest voice of all the male voices, and it's usually associated with a very dark timbre, sonorous, organ pipe-like low notes, and often very authoritative. And as such, most of the roles that are assigned to singers with bass voices are roles of kings, high priests, and even the devil, and also sometimes father figures. But did you know that the bass, apart from its obligation to hurl out sonorous low notes in opera, they were also expected to fulfill other tasks. Now, as we look at these 5 arias, we will find out that very difficult music has actually been assigned to the bass voice, apart of course from giving us very, very low notes. The first difficult aria for bass I'm going to talk about is the aria O wie will ich triumphieren from Mozart, The Abduction of Seraglio. And I'm sure that you would have probably heard about this opera in a previous episode, and its link can be found here. And in that previous episode, I mentioned that The Abduction from Seraglio is a Singspiel, which is an opera which is interspersed with spoken dialogue, usually German dialogue, because Singspiel is a German word. So one other famous Singspiel written by Mozart is The Magic Flute. To be differentiated from his other Italian operas like Idomeneo, Le Nozze di Figaro, Così fan tutte, and Don Giovanni, these operas are completely sung from the beginning to the end with recitatives and arias and duets and musical ensembles. Whereas in a Singspiel like The Abduction from the Seraglio or The Magic Flute, these musical numbers are interspersed with German dialogue. As you would have heard from the little excerpt that I have put up just now, you will realize how technically demanding this aria is for the bass voice. Now, what is the bass expected to do? It not only features rapid precision coloratura, there are also abrupt octave leaps from the low register of the bass voice to the high register. And last but not least, the bass is expected to descend into the lower depths of its tessitura and to sustain the low D for 7 measures. And this note is the lowest note ever written for an operatic singer in all of operatic history. Obviously, when Mozart wrote this aria, he had a singer in mind, and this singer happens to be the famous bass called Ludwig Fischer, an extraordinary singer who was able to fulfill all these technical demands written into the aria by Mozart. Originally, the role of Osmin in the opera was not a major one, but because of the participation of this extraordinary singer Ludwig Fischer, Mozart had written more music into this part, that Mozart actually wrote to his father that with the participation of Ludwig Fischer, more music must be written in the opera so as to make good use of him and to feature his outstanding instrument, especially his lower register, which was why today we are so lucky to have this aria in our heritage that features such difficult music. And I have to say that apart from Kurt Moll, I don't think there is any other bass in recent history that has been able to sing it the way Kurt Moll has sung it, and I believe that he is the singer in recent years or in recent operatic history that has sort of like reached or possibly even reached or surpassed the technical requirements demanded of this aria by Mozart. Second difficult aria for bass is the aria Sorgete Sorgete in Si bel giorno from Rossini's opera Maometto II, sung by the titular character Maometto II. From listening to the aria, you would realize how difficult it is because the aria is entirely composed of coloratura after coloratura. Now, what is coloratura? Coloratura basically is florid singing, meaning a syllable being extended over many notes to cover a melody. This is a rather unusual music for a bass, because such music, if you are a serious opera connoisseur or a person that knows a bit of opera, you realize that coloratura singing is usually in the premise of a soprano voice or a light and agile voice. Now, a typical bass, which is usually dark and sonorous and low, is usually not associated for this kind of singing, which is why this kind of music for a bass is considered extremely difficult. Which is why the opera Maometto II and a whole series of operas by Rossini have been in neglect from the second half of the 19th century to the first half of the 20th century because of the lack of voices that are able to take up the technical challenges of such music. However, this was not the case in the second half of the 20th century with the founding of the Fondazione of the Rossini Foundation and the Rossini Opera Festival in Pesaro. This has led to the discovery of neglected and forgotten operas written by Rossini. Rossini before that was known as the one opera composer, the opera being the Barber of Seville, which I've mentioned in a previous episode, whose link you can see here. However, with the efforts of scholarship by the foundation in the discovery of these neglected operas, like for example Rossini's serious operas like Maometto II or Semiramide, and the other neglected comic operas like Il Turco in Italia, L'Italiana in Algeri, the efforts and the scholarship of the critical edition by the foundation and the subsequent production and performance by the Rossini Opera Festival has led to what we called the Rossini Renaissance. However, this Renaissance would not have been complete without the discovery of singers in the second half of the 20th century who were able to meet the challenges of Rossini's music. It was easier, of course, to find a light and agile soprano who can meet the technical challenges of the agility in Rossini's music. However, for a bass, it would have been much more challenging to find a bass who was able to sing the music of Rossini as he intended it to be. Now, Rossini expected or wrote music and expected all his singers to be able to execute coloratura, which means from soprano to mezzo-soprano to tenor to bass. And when he wrote the role of Maometto Secondo, as also the role of Mustafa in L'Italiana in Algeri, as for Selim in the, Il Turco in Italia, he wrote it with the famous bass Filippo Galli in mind, who was an Italian bass in the first half of the 19th century, who had such extraordinary capabilities of agility, who was able to meet the challenges of Rossini's music. Fortunately for us, in the 21st century, or in the second half of the 20th century, the emergence of Samuel Ramey as the de facto Rossini bass allowed full productions of Rossini's forgotten operas to be performed. In fact, he was the first Maometto Secondo after decades, and it was met with instant success. Now, if you hear Ramey's voice, you will realize that Ramey's voice is not as full and dark as a conventional bass. In fact, Rossini intended for his basses who were able to sing his coloratura to be somewhat of a baritonal character. And as such, you will find that subsequent basses that have emerged in the business, such as Michele Pertusi or Ildebrando d'Arcangelo, who were able to meet the demands of Rossini's music, were also not considered the full sonorous bass in a traditional sense. The third difficult aria I'll be discussing today is the Cinta di Fiori, which is Giorgio's aria from Bellini's opera I Puritani. Now, the mention of I Puritani would probably evoke the most famous mad scene by the leading female protagonist Elvira in her aria, in her scene Qui la voce, which she executes like difficult vocal pyrotechnics in the true Bellini style. In fact, Cinta di Fiori is rather an unlikely choice for a difficult aria because it doesn't have all these difficult pyrotechniques written into the role as opposed to Elvira. And it doesn't really seem on the outset a very difficult aria to perform. However, the challenge lies in executing the aria in the way Bellini would have wanted it. Now, whilst one might argue that legato is essential in all Bellini singing and is to be expected from all singers, this is extremely difficult to execute in Cinta di Fiori. A huge part of the aria involves vocal leaps of huge intervals whilst expecting the singer to maintain a seamless legato. And also in the final part of the aria, the bass is expected to sustain a dramatic climax in his passaggio with repeated Cs and D flats and finally arriving in the climactic E flat, which has to be bright and dramatic but which will tire most basses by the time they get there.
Pietra ove sopra se la tiene Capidone lo scaglio Sole
typical aria I will be discussing in today's episode is Verdi's Or chi piange from his opera Nabucco, sung by the character, the bass, the high priest Zaccaria. What is required of the Verdi bass? He is required to have a dark timbre, a dark sonorous timbre, and is expected to make frequent excursions into the highest extremes of his range. However, what is unusual in Verdi's Nabucco is the departure from the bel canto model of having the tenor as the first protagonist. Similar to the casting in his operas like Simon Boccanegra, Macbeth, Falstaff, and above all Attila, you will find that the baritone and bass have been put in focus as the main protagonists of the opera, as is the case of Nabucco. As such, the bass and baritone have replaced the tenor in terms of importance as the main protagonist of the action. As you will note that Ismaele, the tenor role in Nabucco, is a secondary one, as is also the case in Gabriele, the tenor in Simon Boccanegra, where Boccanegra, the baritone, and Fiesco are the main male protagonists. This accentuates Verdi's genius in using the male lower voices to paint a tableau of a patriarchal, political, and above all a dark and sinister atmosphere, as opposed to the more conventional themes of love and romance. In Or chi piange, Verdi requires stratospheric repeated high F sharps from the bass, which is a very unusual note to expect from the bass voice, but at the same time also expecting him to execute low Gs and low F sharps as traditionally required of a bass, therefore demanding of the voice a big and flexible timbre and dark timbre to be able to rise to the top and expect him to go to the bottom as well. And this highlights a tendency for Verdi, as with the baritone, as I've explained in a previous chapter whose link you can see here, that Verdi writes a third high not only for the baritone but also for the bass. So as such, by elevating the tessitura of both the bass and baritones, he also elevates the importance of the baritone and the bass role in the opera, and correspondingly he gives an increased importance to the lower male voices in his operas, such as Simon Boccanegra, in Nabucco in this case, and in Attila, where Attila, who is the title role, is sung by a bass.
Chi l'ha fatto delle spille? Chi la pesca delle anguille? Editate in ogni lato. Sono stato contornato di memorie, petizioni, di galline, di storioni, di bottiglie, di broccati, di candele marinate, di ciambelle, pasticcetti, di canditi, di confetti, di piastroni, di domani, di vaniglie, di caffè. Ogni lato, sono stato contornato, ogni lato, sono stato contornato di ciambelle, pasticcetti, di canditi, di confetti, di piastroni, di domani, di vaniglie, di caffè. Basta, 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 basta. Non portate, non portate. Terminate. Ve ne andate. Non portate. Basta, in carità.
Fifth typical aria for bass is the Sia qualunque filia from Rossini's opera La Cenerentola. Now, why have I put two Rossini operas in a same episode? As you have listened to the excerpt, you realize that in the Sia qualunque filia excerpt is different from the singing in the Maometto Secondo excerpt. Now, the difference is the difference between what is patter and what is coloratura singing. Now, I've mentioned what is patter, and this is covered in a previous episode, which link you can find here. Now, patter basically means syllabic singing, which means singing at very quick speed, according each individual note to each individual syllable. This is as opposed to melismatic singing or color singing, which involves singing several notes to one syllable. As such, these are two different techniques, although both techniques require a light and agile voice to execute. So whilst melismatic or coloratura singing, as I have mentioned earlier, is infrequently requested from a bass singer, bass singers, however, are usually called upon to perform patter and to execute the patter to comic effect. So whereas while bel canto coloratura is more of a manifestation of a noble feeling or a serious affectation, patter is usually a comic attribute. And as such, because basses are usually called upon to execute a patter to comic effect, this has resulted in the formation of a vocal category called the comic bass or the basso buffo. This has formed a whole category of roles in the operatic repertoire, such as the title role of Don Pasquale.
Vedrai se giovino origini camine sorridi teneri ispira lacrime bagnaci dove non medici domino sorridi teneri ispira lacrime vuole prendere la mia vincere vuole prendere la mia vincere se la tavola la star se la tavola la star la mia
Du Camara in Elisir d'Amore, The Elixir of Love. As well as characters like Don Magnifico in the excerpt here in La Cenerentola. And as such, the more words, the faster the patter, the more difficult the role. Now there is another character in La Cenerentola called Dandini. Well, a Dandini is a person which we call a mezzo carattere, which is a hybrid kind of character which has both coloratura
ne ho vedute già tante e poi tante
as well as patter. Dandini was characterized by Rossini as such because Dandini impersonates the prince to actually test Cinderella's two stepsisters to see if they had genuine affections. So on the one hand, he's a comic character expected to perform patter. He also has coloratura in his imitation of the prince. So you can see how the bel canto system works, where coloratura expresses noble feelings such as Maometto Secondo in Rossini's serious opera, as opposed to patter, which expresses the more comic side of the character. I have come to the end of my episode. If you find that this episode on 5 difficult arias for bass useful, please like my channel, subscribe my channel, and don't forget to also click the notification button for future uploads. And this is Martin Ng from the Martin Ng channel, and I hope to see you for the next episode. Bye!